Rome didn't just win battles. It collected aftermath. Picture a victory parade, banners snapping, armor flashing, a city roaring with pride. Now look past the gold. Because behind the trophies came the part Rome preferred you not to name. Women. Bound. Silent. Not because they were fine, but because they already understood what came after the cheering. And here's the twist that makes it worse: this wasn't random cruelty. It was procedure. We're taught the clean version. Captives became slaves. Mines, farms, households. Brutal, yes, but neat. Contained. Easy to file away as how the ancient world worked. But what happened in the first hours after a city fell, before any market, before any paperwork, was the real message of Roman victory. A ritual of power. Not just to hurt bodies, but to break identity. To turn a person into an object while an army watched, and learned what Rome wins really meant. And the sickest part? We don't have to imagine it. The language survives: letters, reports, cold bureaucratic words that describe warm humans suffering like inventory. Because Rome didn't just conquer land. It made an example. And the example started in the open, in the middle of the ruined city, where there was nowhere to look except straight ahead. The first night after the walls broke wasn't a celebration. It was sorting. Men of fighting age were pulled one way. Some executed fast. Some saved for later violence: the arena, the mines, the slow kind of dying. Children and the elderly? Sometimes abandoned. Sometimes disposed of, because an army doesn't like extra mouths. Then came the category Rome treated differently. The women. Not as a blur. Not as collateral. As a resource to be processed. They were gathered where the whole legion could see: squares, forums, temple steps, because humiliation works better with witnesses. It wasn't enough that they were defeated. They had to be seen as defeated. Hours passed. Sometimes days. Officers walked the line, not like men looking at humans, but like buyers inspecting goods. The most desirable were marked and separated. Not for mercy. For rank. And that's when you realize what conquest meant in Rome. It wasn't just taking your city. It was taking the future you would have had in it. The rest weren't spared. They were allocated. Assigned. Distributed. A word so calm it almost hides the screams inside it. Because when something becomes distribution, it stops sounding like a crime, and starts sounding like policy. And once it's policy, it happens again. And again. And again. But what happens during that first allocation, before anyone is marched out, before anyone is branded, was the moment that broke most of them for good. And Rome made sure nobody forgot it. There's a reason Rome's violence felt unstoppable. It wasn't only the sword. It was the message behind the sword. When a commander allowed his men certain privileges after victory, it wasn't just indulgence. It was instruction. A demonstration of what resistance costs. A warning carved into living bodies so the next city would surrender faster. Think about that. This wasn't passion. It was politics. Because once you can turn someone's daughter into proof of your power, you don't just defeat an army. You defeat a people's will to rise again. And it worked. Ancient writers describe rebellions that died not because the rebels ran out of fighters, but because communities learned through terror what Rome would do if they lost. Rome didn't have to say it out loud. The survivors carried the announcement for them. And after those first days, after the unspeakable celebration, came the calmest, cruelest shift of all: paperwork. Logistics. Ownership. That's where the horror gets colder. Because now the same woman who was just treated like a prize becomes an entry on a list. A unit. Something that can be taxed, transferred, and sold. And once a human is reduced to a line item, there's no natural limit to what you can do to them, because the system is built to keep moving. The parade ends. The cheering fades. But the machinery starts. Chains. Marches. Ports. And somewhere between the ruined city and the sea, many realized something terrifying. The conquest wasn't over. It was just changing uniforms. The march was designed to erase the last thing they still owned: choice. Groups were chained together, 10, 20 at a time, because a single captive might run, but a line of captives can't. If one stumbles, the others drag her. If one collapses, the chain punishes everyone. And the road didn't care. Days became weeks. Dust. Blistered feet. Throats raw from thirst. And always the knowledge that the soldiers behind them weren't escorting people. They were delivering cargo. At the ports, the women were held in warehouses, the same kind used for grain, oil, wine, until ships were ready. That detail matters. Because it shows you the mindset: storage, inventory, Supply. Then came the crossing. Below deck. Little air. Less space. Bodies packed tight. Chains biting skin. Rations calculated not for health, but for survival, just enough to keep value from dying too quickly. And when someone did die, no ceremony. No record. Just the sea swallowing what Rome didn't need anymore. You think the worst part would be the violence. But for many, the worst part was the certainty. Nobody was coming. No rescue. No appeal. No witness who would testify for them later. The horizon wasn't freedom. It was Rome. And Rome was where people became prices. The auctions weren't hidden in alleys. They were public. Normal. Crowded. That's what makes it sick, how ordinary it was. Buyers didn't look for souls. They looked for signs. Teeth checked. Skin pinched. Mouths forced open. Scars judged like defects in a tool. Pregnancy treated like a complication in a deal. And the women learned a new kind of fear, not the fear of dying, but the fear of being chosen. Because chosen didn't mean saved. It meant purchased for a specific use. The youngest fetched the highest price. The most exotic drew the most attention. Foreignness itself became a selling point, proof that conquest reached far, proof that Rome could take anyone from anywhere. Some were bought for households, where abuse could be private and endless. Others were bought for labor, where bodies broke fast. And some were bought for places Rome didn't even pretend were respectable: legal brothels, regulated rooms where the empire collected taxes from the repeated destruction of a captive's body. That's the part people don't like to say out loud. The state didn't just tolerate it. It profited. And when a system makes money from suffering, it doesn't stop because it's wrong. It stops only when it runs out of victims. But Rome didn't run out. Not for centuries. Here's what's hard to grasp: Rome turned violation into a souvenir of victory. For some citizens, paying a few coins to use a captive woman wasn't just pleasure. It was participation. A cheap way to feel like a conqueror without ever holding a sword. Victory by proxy. And the woman didn't even get a name. She became the Gaul. The German. The Judean. A category, not a person. Like a dish ordered off a menu. The rooms were small. Bare. A curtain as a door. Men in lines. Time measured in bodies. The day didn't end when she begged it to, only when the owner decided her work was done. And even if she survived, her survival was twisted. Because survival meant learning to disconnect from your own body. To stop being you to endure what was happening to you. That's when conquest becomes something worse than murder. Murder ends a life. This tried to erase the idea that a life ever mattered. And if you think this is the darkest point, Rome had another tool, one that made sure even freedom couldn't undo what was done. It left a mark. Branding. Not a metaphor. Not an insult. An iron. Ownership burned into flesh so the world could read what Rome had decided you were. Sometimes on the body. Sometimes, more cruelly, where it couldn't be hidden. A face marked so you could never blend in again. That's when you understand, Rome wasn't only capturing labor. It was manufacturing shame. Because shame isolates. Shame keeps people quiet. Shame makes survivors police themselves. And once the mark was there, even if someone escaped, even if someone was freed years later, the past walked with them into every room. People could see it. They could guess. They could treat her like the mark was the truth. This is why so few first-person voices survive. Not just because the victims couldn't write, but because the empire designed their lives so thoroughly that even speaking felt dangerous. Yet sometimes, rarely, fragments slipped through history's fingers. A sentence in a trial record. A remark in an interrogation. A line that sounds small until you realize what it contains. One woman, when asked if she feared death, reportedly said something like, "I died a long time ago." And the fact that a human being could say that, calmly, tells you Rome's conquest didn't end at the battlefield. It followed you. It lived inside you. Rome loved to call itself civilization. Law. Order. Roads. Aqueducts. Marble temples. A world made better under the eagle. But here's the contradiction hiding in plain sight. The same empire that wrote legal codes also built a machine that turned human beings into merchandise, and called it normal. That's why the story gets softened in modern retellings. Because if you stare too directly at this, you start asking uncomfortable questions about what civilization means, and who pays for it. It's easier to admire Rome's architecture than to picture the warehouses at the ports. It's easier to celebrate military genius than to follow the chained line of women down a dirt road. It's easier to talk about slavery as a concept than to describe what conquest did to a single person with a name. And that's the part Rome stole most successfully. Names. The women became numbers in reports, units in inventories, a shipment, a loss rate. Cold words that make violence feel like math. But math doesn't scream. People do. And the silence in the records isn't proof it didn't happen. Sometimes silence is what terror creates best. There's a moment in every empire where the violence comes back. Not as karma in a storybook sense, just as history doing what history does. Later writers describe invasions where Roman towns were taken and Roman women were captured. And some accounts mention something chilling, not always panic, sometimes resignation. As if they recognized the pattern. As if they understood in their bones that the world they lived under had taught others this method. That somewhere long ago, Rome had set the rules, and now someone else was playing by them. That doesn't make the suffering deserved. It doesn't reduce the horror by even one breath. It just reveals a truth we hate. Systems of cruelty don't vanish. They change hands. And that's why this topic matters beyond ancient history. Because if you can convince yourself these were different people, from a different time, you never have to look at the present. You never have to ask what modern war does under modern language. You never have to ask who is being turned into inventory right now. But once you see Rome clearly, you start noticing echoes. And echoes are warnings. So why isn't this the main story everyone learns? Because Rome is a foundation myth. Its law shaped later law. Its military shaped later militaries. Its symbols still sit on modern buildings like a crown. And if you admit the foundation included systematic sexual violence, public humiliation, and state profit from human degradation, you have to rethink what you're admiring. That's uncomfortable. And discomfort is exactly what gets edited out of classrooms, movies, and fun facts history. We get the eagle standards, the genius generals, the clean marble. We don't get the brothel next to the arena. We don't get the warehouse at the port. We don't get the paperwork that turned a woman into a taxable asset. Because the moment you include those, glory starts to look like something else. And then the story stops being about Rome. It becomes about us, about what we choose to remember, and what we train ourselves not to see. And there's one last question hanging over all of it. If a society can normalize this much cruelty and still call itself civilized, what are we normalizing right now? Here's the cruelest detail of all. The machine worked because everyone played a role. Soldiers took. Officers organized. Merchants shipped. Buyers inspected. Brothel owners scheduled. Tax collectors counted coins. Citizens lined up. And because it was shared, it felt normal. That's how a horror becomes a tradition. Not through one monster, but through thousands of ordinary people doing what's done, and telling themselves it's just the way the world works. And if you're listening to this and feeling that tightness in your chest, that urge to look away, that's the exact reaction history like this triggers. Because it forces you to admit something about human nature. People don't need to be evil to participate in evil. They just need a system that rewards it, and language that disguises it. Rome had both. And the women caught in it rarely left a voice behind. No memoirs, no diaries, no long testimony, only faint traces in other people's writing. Which means the final violence wasn't just what was done to their bodies. It was what was done to their memory. Erased twice. So here's the payoff, the line that should change how you see every triumphal parade, every golden age, every empire story told like an adventure. Rome didn't accidentally commit horrors on the way to greatness. It built greatness with them. And when we repeat the clean version, when we admire the roads but ignore the chains, we finish the job Rome started, we turn suffering into background noise. That doesn't mean we erase Rome from history. It means we stop worshipping a myth. Because the real lesson isn't ancient people were barbaric. The real lesson is that cruelty becomes easiest when it's organized, justified, and profitable, when it wears the costume of order. And that's why this story still matters. Not to sensationalize pain, but to refuse the silence that made it possible. So the next time you hear the word civilization, ask yourself one question. Civilization for who? Rome's darkest trick wasn't violence. It was how quickly violence became normal. After the ships docked and the auctions emptied, the empire didn't see survivors. It saw categories, labels, uses. A woman's entire life reduced to one question: where does she generate value? Households, workshops, farms, mines. And here's the part that stings: even the people who never marched in a legion could still buy a piece of victory. For a few coins, an ordinary citizen could feel like a conqueror, because the defeated were made available, like proof that Rome was still on top. That's why the system lasted. Not because a few leaders were cruel. Because an entire society was built to benefit from the defeated. And once that's true, silence becomes part of the machine. Not just silence in books, silence in people. Neighbors. Families. Customers. Everyone looking away, because looking too closely would mean admitting what they were living on. But history has a way of folding back on itself. Because the same methods Rome used to erase other people eventually came back toward Rome. And when it did, something strange shows up in the later accounts, something you wouldn't expect. Not always screams. Sometimes, resignation. By the later centuries, Rome wasn't only the hunter. It started becoming the hunted. Frontiers cracked. Raids turned into invasions. Towns that once cheered legions began to hear foreign drums in the distance. And suddenly, Roman families faced the same nightmare Rome had inflicted across Europe and beyond. Writers describe Roman women taken during these incursions. And in a few lines, easy to miss, you see a chilling psychological truth. Some didn't react with shock. They reacted like they recognized the script. Like they understood on some deep level that empires teach the world how to treat the defeated, and sooner or later, someone repeats the lesson. That doesn't make it justice. It doesn't reduce the cruelty by even a breath. It just proves something uncomfortable: systems of domination don't disappear. They migrate. And that's why this story isn't only about ancient Rome. It's about the kind of world humans build when they decide power is permission. Because the scariest question isn't were Romans monsters? It's how many ordinary people does it take to make monstrosity feel like a routine? And once you ask that, you start seeing Rome everywhere, especially in the parts of modern history that are written with the same careful, polite vagueness. So why don't we hear this version in school? Because Rome is sold to us as a template. The birth of Western law, Western order, Western greatness. Columns, courts, roads, rhetoric. And if you put the full truth beside the marble, you can't admire it the same way. Because then you have to admit the empire's efficiency wasn't just in engineering. It was in exploitation. It was in turning human beings into inventory, then using clean words to make it sound civilized. Distribution. Transfer. Property. Language that scrubs blood off the page. We're comfortable with gladiators because the violence looks like a spectacle with rules. We're uncomfortable with captives because the violence looks like us. Systems. Bureaucracy. People following procedures and calling it necessity. That's why movies cut away. That's why textbooks blur the details. Because the moment you show what victory meant for the most vulnerable, the myth collapses. And once the myth collapses, the final question lands where it should have landed from the beginning. If Rome could call itself civilized while doing this, what do we call civilized today that future generations will be horrified by? The most dangerous lie in history is the one that says, that was them. This is us. Because Rome didn't run on madness. It ran on incentives. Soldiers were rewarded. Merchants got paid. Officials collected taxes. Buyers got what they wanted. And the victims, stripped of language, names, and witnesses, became the easiest kind of suffering to ignore, suffering that can't argue back. That's why the record sounds so calm. A shipment. A transfer. A loss. A purchase. The violence wasn't only in what was done. It was in how cleanly it was filed. And once you understand that, the story stops being an ancient horror story and becomes a mirror. Because every time a modern system reduces people to numbers, displaced, detained, collateral, you're seeing the same trick in new clothes. Rome's legacy isn't just roads and arches. It's the proof that a society can build beauty on top of cruelty, and still call it order. So here's the twist that should stay with you after the video ends. The women Rome erased didn't just vanish. They became the hidden foundation of an empire we still romanticize. And if we keep telling the clean version, if we keep cheering the parade and cutting away from the chains, then the final victory Rome wins isn't over them. It's over our memory. If you want to know how complete Rome's control was, look at what's missing. We have speeches from senators. We have triumph lists. We have the names of generals carved into stone. We even have petty gossip scratched into walls. But for the women taken after victory, almost nothing in their own voice. Not because nothing happened. Because Rome designed it so their story wouldn't survive. No education in Latin. No access to ink. No legal standing. No one to record testimony and call it history. And even if a survivor spoke, who would treat her words as equal to a commander's report. That's the second conquest, the conquest of narrative. First the body is taken. Then the future. Then the memory. And when later generations look back, they see marble and order, because the people who could have described the cost were erased from the archive. So when you hear someone say, if it was that bad, where are the accounts? That question is part of the violence. The absence is evidence of how effective the system was. And yet, every once in a while, a crack appears, a line in a legal proceeding, a hostile historian's aside, a medical text describing common conditions, as if trauma were just another symptom. Little fragments that whisper what the official story refuses to say out loud. But there's one more layer Rome used to keep this machine running, something that didn't require chains at all. It required belief. Rome didn't just conquer people. It taught everyone watching what power means. When a city fell, the survivors learned a lesson more persuasive than any speech. Laws protect you only when the law belongs to you. The moment it doesn't, order becomes a weapon. And that lesson traveled faster than legions ever could. Neighboring towns heard the stories and opened their gates sooner. Tribes negotiated before fighting. Leaders chose surrender not because they loved Rome, but because they feared what Rome did after victory. That's why this wasn't undisciplined soldiers. It was strategy. Terror, used like diplomacy. And once terror becomes policy, it gets defended. People build excuses around it. That's war. That's the ancient world. That's how empires worked. But those excuses are dangerous because they're reusable. They let any era wash its hands by saying, we had to. So the real reason this history matters isn't to shock you. It's to make you notice the moment language turns humans into something else. Because when a society starts talking about people the way it talks about cargo, it's already halfway to treating them like cargo. And that's why Rome still feels close. Not because we share their weapons. Because we still understand their justifications. Which leaves one final question, one you can't dodge once you've seen the machine clearly. If victory can turn into entitlement, who do we become when we're the ones who win? Here's the part nobody expects. Rome's cruelty didn't require hatred. It required distance. If the captive is foreign, she's easier to dehumanize. If she's enemy, she's easier to use. If she's a spoils, she stops being a person and becomes proof. And once the empire trained citizens to see defeated women as symbols instead of humans, it created a marketplace of indifference. People could participate and still feel righteous, because the victim had been rebranded as something less. That's how ordinary men became part of conquest without marching anywhere. That's how the empire turned private acts into public ideology. And it's why Rome's violence was so effective. It wasn't just physical domination. It was psychological conditioning, teaching everyone who watched that resistance ends in humiliation, and that humiliation is normal. But systems like this always have a weak point. Not morality. Logistics. Because the moment an empire has too many wars, too many captives, too much hunger for spoils, it creates something it can't fully control: desperation. Crowded holding areas. Brutal owners. Overworked bodies. And desperation sometimes produces the one thing Rome feared more than rebellion on a battlefield. Rebellion from inside the machine. When people have nothing left to lose, fear stops working. That's when the empire's property becomes unpredictable. Records from across the Roman world mention uprisings, some small, some bloody, sparked not by armies, but by enslaved people inside estates and settlements. And when women were part of these revolts, Rome's response was always the same: make it public. Make it slow. Make it unforgettable. Because Rome wasn't only punishing the rebels. It was repairing the message. If captives could fight back, even once, the spell of inevitability cracks. And empires cannot afford cracks. They must look permanent. They must feel like the natural order. So the punishments became theater. The goal wasn't justice. It was intimidation, reminding everyone watching what happens when inventory tries to become human again. And yet, even when Rome crushed these revolts, something had already changed. The violence had taught a lesson it didn't intend to teach. Power isn't sacred. It's a technique. And techniques can be copied. That's why later enemies didn't just defeat Rome militarily. They learned how Rome worked, how it threatened, how it humiliated, how it erased, and they used pieces of the same logic against it. Which brings us to the final uncomfortable landing point of this whole story. Because if Rome's greatest weapon was organized cruelty, then the real legacy of Rome isn't in stone. It's in what humans will do when a system tells them they're allowed. So when people ask, why dig this up? Why not let the past stay buried? Here's the answer. Because the past doesn't stay buried. It gets recycled. Rome is remembered as discipline, law, and grandeur because those are the parts that flatter us. But the empire's smoothness, its roads, its ledgers, its supply chains, also made exploitation efficient. And that's the warning. Horror doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives stamped, sealed, and signed. Sometimes it arrives as a procedure everyone follows so they don't have to feel responsible. That's why the most chilling detail in all of this isn't a single brutal act. It's the normalization. The way a whole society can step over suffering, day after day, and call itself civilized because the buildings are beautiful and the language is polite. And if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Whenever a culture celebrates victory without asking who paid for it, someone's pain is being edited out on purpose. Rome did it with marble. We do it with headlines, euphemisms, and necessary decisions. The women taken after Roman conquest were denied names, denied voices, denied memory. But the fact that we can still trace the outline of what happened, despite the silence, is proof the machine wasn't just violent. It was proud. So don't just remember Rome's glory. Remember the cost. Because the moment we stop looking at the cost, is the moment we become capable of paying it again.